It's time to start looking into how we're going to handle a basic user interface. For the time being, we're only going to be tracking one variable, but we'll expand this later. Initially, what we're going to be tracking is the player's score. Now, in the previous session, we went about setting up a basic print string that was outputting the score to the screen. We removed it because it was purely there for the sake of debugging and identifying that the feature worked. But this time around, let's go ahead and create a new widget that will act as our HUD. So I want you to right-click in your Blueprints folder, go to your user interface, and then go down to Widget Blueprint. Now I'm going to call this Pinball HUD, and this is going to open up UMG. Now there are two areas to UMG. You've got your designer and your graph. Now when you're in your designer, you're able to drop in buttons, checkboxes, progress bars, anything that you want. Now when you're in the graph, you're able to actually set functionality for each of these elements in the same way that you would typically set up something in Blueprint. So it should be very familiar to everyone. In this situation though, we're going to create something reasonably straightforward, which is simply going to output some text. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this text into the screen, not the text box, but the text. Text refers to visible text on screen, whereas text box refers to something that you can enter text into, for example, a high score or a name. So I'm going to drag this text block in, and we're going to set this up so that it's going to be our player score. It's just going to sit in the top left-hand corner of the screen. For the time being, I'm not going to bother customizing any fonts or anything like that. I just want to get the functionality up and running. So I want to go through a few things first though. Now, to begin with, we have this unusual flower-looking icon that's appeared that actually represents the anchor point. Now, this anchor point essentially helps us set it up so that no matter what size the screen is, this item knows where it should be relative to the ratio of its position on the screen. So if I was to put this here, and I was to change the screen size, for instance, to a iPhone 6, you can see that this is still saying that same distance from this corner. If I was to drop out and I was to go to a 1080i, you can see that it's sitting here. So this is very, very useful for us because it lets us make sure that ahead of time this is going to look correct on a number of different monitors and that elements are going to associate themselves with the screen in the correct way. Now it's a good idea for us to begin by just entering the text that we're likely to have. So I'm going to have score, space, and I'm just going to enter an incredibly big number. And this is going to show us the first issue that we're going to have, which is that our text box is only the size that it was originally dragged in as. And yes, I could drag this out, but it's a better idea for me to check this box that says size to content. Size to content is going to automatically change the size of the box as the content inside of it gets bigger, which does most of our job for us. Now we could also change the justification, but in this case it's not going to be necessary because aligning the text from the left is actually what we want to do. If we were to be developing the HUD from the right hand side of the screen, we may want to justify it this way so that the score gradually pushes towards the center from the right hand side, but for the time being we're fine. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is actually set this up to have some sort of text in it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at this section that said text, and this is where I entered the value. But next to it we have a nice little button that says bind. This is where we have the option to create a binding, which essentially lets us have a blueprint graph determine what this text should be. Before I do that though, I'm just going to name this to something that's a bit better than what we have as the default. So I'm going to click over here, I'm going to hit F2 to rename, and I'm just going to call this player score, just so we have something that's a bit more understandable when we come back to it later. I'm now going to create a binding on the text, and it's going to load up a graph. So within this function, we essentially have an execute pin that's going to run through and do whatever logic we want here, and it's going to output a text string, and that text string is whatever it is that we want to have in that text binding. So this is rather straightforward, and that is that all I need to do is right click and get the game mode. I'm going to cast the game mode to the pinball game mode, which is the one that we've created. Now I could do this as pure, I probably should, purely because game modes can be set up in a number of different ways. I'm just going to be very careful here, and I'm going to duplicate the return node, and on failed I'm going to return an empty string. However, I don't expect it to ever fail. Instead, I'm going to get the pinball game mode, and I'm going to get the score, which is this value here, just get score. And all I need to do from here is, if I connect this to the text node, it's going to automatically convert from float to text. So this would put the number on screen by itself. However, there is another slightly nicer way for us to do this. I'm going to drag off of the text instead, and I'm going to type in the word format. And we get this nice little function called format text, which essentially lets you create a string. So in this case, I'm going to write the word score, colon, space, and then anything that I put into braces, so the squiggly brackets for those unfamiliar, I can go ahead and actually have them as inputs. So I do a brace, I'm going to type in player score, and then a closing brace and hit enter, and it's going to give me this as a variable, which I can now just plug into there, and then connect over here. Now the final stage to getting this working is simply to go to my player controller, and on begin play I'm going to call a function that says create player HUD, which is going to be a custom event, and this custom event is going to be launched by my begin play. Now all I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag off of create player HUD, and I'm going to set it up such that it initially removes any widgets from the player's current viewport. So if there is a menu or anything on screen, it's going to get rid of that. At which point, after doing that, we're going to create a widget, and the widget that we create is going to be our pinball HUD. We're now going to add to viewport. We can hit compile and save, and if I go pinball and hit play, you can now see that we have the score variable on screen, and every time I hit something, it's going to increase and set itself up correctly. So that's it. That's all it takes to get the beginnings of a working HUD.